One of the main things I hadn't covered on the channel much before are loadouts for the weapons in game, now pumping out that juicy DPS. That said, you all loved the Voltia video that I made, so I think it's overdue I start looking at the other weapons and bringing you some of the strongest DPS builds out there for you to use in your games. Now in today's video we'll be diving into my strongest build for the monster that is the Enduring Legacy, and how Season 2 buffed it up so much that it's just not even close in the race for the best single target DPS in the game, to the point that it can do this to dead right.
The chase and the hunt, and I set the pace when I'm running. I always take what I want and I always give it 100. Don't need a bank, no I'm funded.
Now we'll break it down by looking at the best modules in slot for the gun, what Descendants help to get the most out of it, what component sets can use to be able to make it stronger, and lastly why the new seasonal reinforcement is just the cream on top. So let's kick it off with the build and let's start talking about modules. Now for us to get an idea as to what are the best modules to slot in, we really should have a look at what the Enduring Legacy is, and then start having a look as to, get an idea as to what makes it so strong. Now I fully appreciate that obviously this is Season 2, Enduring Legacy has been out a while, people probably already have a good idea as to what the Enduring Legacy is good at, but just to give you an idea as to how you can know if a gun, or what you should be building into when it comes to a gun, you essentially head over to this detail stats stage here, and you just have a quick look as to what we kind of like have there. The main thing we want to look at are going to be multipliers, because multipliers are going to be base figures, and then when we start slotting in modules, that are going to get a better increase if they're above 1x. In the case of this, we do have a very good critical hit rate, which is quite reliable at 20%. We do have a fantastic critical hit damage, and that is obviously going to be one of the main focuses we will be doing. And then on top of that, when it comes to weak point damage, we only have a 1x, so it's not really going to benefit from just being able to get those accurate shots when it comes to weak point, but it is going to massively benefit from landing all those critical hits. Now, we can probably also get an idea when it comes to unique ability, to get an idea if it's going to be emphasizing when it comes to doing extra damage on weak point or criticals or extra firearm attack, anything along those lines. And in the case of the Enduring Legacy, we do have this bit here on hitting an enemy inflicted with burn, getting an extra 11% to our firearm attack. So the main thing we want to do with this is go into fire attack, because we want to trigger that burn as often as possible so that we have that 11% up as long as possible. On top of that, we also have quenching. Quenching is going to be reducing fire resistance all the way up to around about 45% if you do have it at max stacks and fully maxed out as a weapon. So we do have that as well. And then on top of that, on hit, we also have an additional way of being able to increase our attribute status effect trigger rate. And this is going to be kind of like works out quite nicely when it comes to this gun, because at base it has a 4.76%, but then adding an extra 6% on top of that is fantastic, meaning that essentially every shot, 1 in 10, is going to be being able to trigger that burn, and that essentially means it is a complete package if you do put fire attack on this, because it has a chance of being able to fulfill its own conditions to do even more damage at standard. So that means when we get to the modules section, we already have a good idea as to what we kind of want to build into. Now the first thing that we should be doing when it comes to any kind of weapon, if we are planning on shooting them, is increasing the firearm attack. In this case, we are going to be using the tried and tested. This is going to be every single time. It's going to be rifling reinforcement, as well as action and reaction, giving us a nice 93% increase to our firearm attack. Essentially almost doubling ourselves from where we were previously, increasing that to a nice 25.3k. This is going to be every single shot, which is quite nice, but obviously we're not done just there. Now the other thing that we did talk about is going to be critical hit damage. As you can see, it has a very nice kind of like base multiplier. So what we want to do is we want to go into crit, we type in crit, and we want to grab better concentration for almost 75% increase to our multiplier. As you can see, it's not just 75% because it already had a very it was more than 1x, so in this case it got multiplied even further. And then we have concentration priority, which is going to take us to an extra 4.48x, so we now sit at 6.78 times, which is fantastic. This is going to be essentially taking that number every single time we land a crit, it's going to be chucking it straight into there. So yeah, it makes more sense for us to go into crit than it does for weak points, because that still sits at 1x. Now we do want to get a little bit of quality of life when it comes to this, because it is an LMG after all. It does have a really good rounds per magazine, so we want to increase that a little bit further by putting in expand weapon charge. This takes us up to 171, which means that we can essentially have more uptime rather than downtime, and we don't have to worry too much about this reload time, because that is going to be exaggerated a little bit more in a second. As for the last bit, when it comes to crit though, we do want to be able to increase that critical hit rate, and in this case the best one is going to be Better Insight. By slotting that in there, that gives us an extra 39%, and that takes us up to a base of 27.8% chance of being able to land a crit. So essentially 1 in 4 hit by itself before we go into any kind of like extra increases to passives or anything like that, means that we're going to be landing that critical hit for that extra amount of damage. Obviously, you know, there are better ways of being able to increase your critical hit rate, things like Edging Shot. Gives you a little bit more increase, but it does hurt our firearm attack, and because of that, don't really want to touch that. We kind of want to keep our firearm attack as nice as possible, and that's going to increase our DPS, keep our DPS nice and consistent, nice and high, and we don't have to worry too much about that. By putting that in there, we're only essentially getting 0.8% increase to our critical hit rate anyway, so it just doesn't make any sense for us to kind of hurt ourselves there. So now we get to talk about the juicy stuff. We get to start talking about the brand new fire package that does exist. So the original stuff that we used to do anyway when it came to Enduring Legacy was we always had a spot for fire enhancement. This one essentially takes your damage, it will then take an extra 30% of that and just turn it into fire element. This will then get affected by things like resistances and everything like that, so it did have a little bit of extra maths behind it, but essentially it was almost like an extra 30% increase to your DPS, but it was treated as a separate entity. One thing to note about that is that if you were critting with your normal shot and then you had fire enhancement on the build, you will essentially crit with this as well. This essentially was like just fantastic increases to the amount of damage that you would be dealing out, but we can take this so much further because of how Season 2 behaves. So one of the first things that we will be doing is going to increase the amount of fire damage that we'll be doing. This is a brand new entity, let's increase it even further, and this allows us to be able to get closer to almost doubling our damage. In this case we do have 2 nods that have been around since pretty much the game launched. This is going to be Superheated Gun Barrel as well as Fire Priority. Now we do have one's obviously going to be doing a little bit more than the other, but in the case of Superheated Gun Barrel, we don't want to go for that one because it's going to reduce our fire rate by 25%. We don't want to reduce the amount of DPS that we're going to be doing to get that benefit, so in this case it makes more sense for us to go into Fire Priority. Now this will hurt our hurt our reload time a little bit more, but just know that essentially what this number was going to be doing, we get an extra 50% on top of that, and that is just essentially going to be based from there. So the reload time modifier doesn't matter too much because essentially once you get to around about the halfway mark, you can cause an action, you can roll, you can then just reload cancel that. So don't worry too much of the fact it says 4 seconds. You can essentially get this down to around about 2.2 seconds or something like that, and then you're pretty much good to go once again. Now the package isn't fully complete right yet because we do have one of the brand new mods to talk about. In this case this is going to be Heat Circulation. How this one works is that once you apply a burn effect to any enemies, this will increase your fire attack by just shy of 90% for 5 seconds, but it does have a cooldown of 20 seconds, so you do have to worry about that 15 seconds where it's doing absolutely nothing for you, but those 5 seconds where this is active, fantastic. This is why we don't want to hurt our fire rate. Essentially we just kind of want to make sure that we do as many bullets, as many hits within those 5 seconds so we can really benefit from what this ability is going to do. So let's start talking about that. If I actually go back to this screen and we just go to the equipped weapon and we start having a look at the breakdown here, you can see that our base firearm attack after everything's been considered is currently sitting at 29.2k, and if we scroll down you can see that our fire attack is currently sitting at 15.2. Now obviously that's a pretty decent stat. We're essentially doing over 50% extra damage just because of all the modules we've got, but if I apply a burn effect, so in this case apply a Flame Pit by Blair, you can see this has now jumped up to 24.4k. Being able to get just shy, it's not quite there to being able to double our damage, but it is still pretty high. Essentially that's what that means. We're essentially trying to get this burn effect so we do more firearm attack, but then we're also getting our increase to our fire damage as well. And as you can see, we've now got it to proc once again, just because of how long that fire pit is down for. And yeah, essentially that's kind of like what we're looking out for. That's the icon to be able to know that we're doing even more damage. Now we do have one extra slot to be able to kind of fill here. Now there are 2 fantastic choices here, depending on the type of fight you're going into, depending on what you're actually trying to achieve. One that you could go for, and one I used to do, was Mental Focus. Just know that every single time you increase your firearm attack, this is going to be chucked straight back into fire enhancement. So the longer you hold down the trigger with this one, essentially this one isn't going to be your burst DPS, this is going to be more sustained, but essentially as you start getting all the way towards like the closer to the end of your clip, or to your magazine, in this case, you'll then have up to 150 stacks, We have increased our magazine, so we can fire 150 shots, and that means that we will get 150% increase to our firearm attack, which then gets chucked back into fire enhancement, chucked back into fire priority, chucked back into heat circulation once that's active. This is a fantastic mod, but it's better for those kind of like public lobbies. It's better for more sustained kind of like DPS, like I've already mentioned. But if you are looking to be able to do like private lobbies by yourself, if you're looking to be able to maximize that window when it comes to heat circulation, then the best one is going to be sharp precision shot. What this does is that as long as you hold down the trigger, you will be increasing your firearm attack faster, you will be increasing your fire rate, and then essentially because of how this kind of works and because of how it triggers, essentially you will be within this damage window, increasing the amount of shots you will be landing, as well as increasing the amount of firearm attack that you will be doing, chucked back into fire enhancement, and you can see as to how this kind of loop goes. So personally, I think this is the best in slot for it, but if you are going for things like Deathstalker, I can definitely see an argument for Mental Focus, so it's definitely worth the extra catalyst to be able to swap back and forth just as you see fit. Now, in terms of the roles when it comes to the gun, I do personally think that these are the best categories to go for. Going for firearm attack is just fantastic, just as standard. Going into firearm critical hit damage, once again, is fantastic. It allows you to be able to hit this kind of like 7, just shy of 7.7 kind of X when it comes to your critical hit damage. Going into bonus firearm attack for Colossus as well as fire attack means that you're adding to your fire attack in both cases if you're hitting Colossus. So therefore, you're then just adding even more into the calculations, and yeah, it's just kind of the way to go. You could make an argument that critical hit rate is possibly needed, and you could possibly swap out fire attack for that, but personally that extra bonus, just standard of fire attack, being able to get chucked into all the calculations, I personally think is the best in slot, and you can kind of get around critical hit rate with things like Descendants that you choose, as well as components. Speaking of components, let's quickly whiz through 3 of the best options to be able to go for if you are going for a gun-based Descendant using the Enduring Legacy. Ideally, you want to be able to increase the amount of base damage you're doing, as well as critical hit rate, things along those kind of lines, but that's where we get the best in slot, which is going to be the Acrobat set. Now, what this one does is it slightly increases your firearm attack, but the main thing is that 21% increase to your critical hit rate means that it works really nicely with some of the passives that you get from other Descendants, so things like Enzo, being able to go for Valby, especially with Blair, getting an extra 21% benefit on top of that for your gun is fantastic, and I do think this is probably best in slot. This made it so that the Enduring Legacy was very consistent in landing those critical hits. Now, other things that you could go for are going to be things like the Veteran set. The Veteran set is pretty decent. It kind of like takes away some of the critical hit rate and makes it more consistent with the amount of base damage it will be doing. So in this case, firearm attack as well as weak point damage, so adding in extra multipliers. But personally, I found that I was doing more consistent clears with the Acrobat set over the Veteran, but you can definitely swap back and forth with those. And then the last one that I will talk about is going to be the Annihilation set. Now, this one essentially takes your kind of gives you an extra increase to your skill duration, but on top of that, once you start losing some of your HP in sustained fights, you will essentially then get extra firearm attack just as base, which then feeds into all of your fire attack. The only downside to using this one is that while it does give you really good survivability kind of like stats, because it kind of requires you to get hit to be able to get low health, it's not necessarily the best for all kind of fights, especially if you are going into private lobbies. You're not going to be triggering that as often, so therefore going for the Acrobat just makes it a little bit more kind of consistent, and it just gives you a benefit right off the bat. And speaking of Descendants that we can use, we do have things like Enzo, being able to go for their modules with like Supply Firearm Enhancer, which increases your weak point damage, your critical hit rate, and being able to increase your base damage as well as even more critical hit rate. So things like that, this kind of setup would be fantastic with the Enduring Legacy. We do also have going for Valby with Supply Moisture, so if it lets me swap over, there we go. Going into Supply Moisture, this increases your critical hit rate as well, and it also kind of gives you a slight bonus to your firearm attack. Not the best in slot, but definitely a decent shout still. And then you've got other things like going for Lepic. Lepic is quite nice with this power unit change. The only downside is that it doesn't give you any kind of like increases to critical hit rate, but it does give you a huge increase to your firearm attack, as well as being able to apply burn when you actually shoot your gun. So you do have that 52% increase, which is then going to get chucked back into your fire attack. Just know that obviously you won't be critting and hitting as often as normal, so you might have to compensate that in other areas, but still a pretty decent shout. But the main one that I do like to go for is going to be my Blair. Blair being able to go for all these critical hit rates increases, being able to go for backdraft, increasing critical hit rates, going for weak point damage, firearm attack increases, things like that. Personally, I think Blair, even though he does have more of a setup, I do think that he's probably the better one, but this is personally my kind of like recommendation for being able to get the most out of the Enduring Legacy. There is one last section we should talk about, and that's going to be the Season 2 Inversion Reinforcement, because this really does kind of crank out the rest of the damage. Where we were just not hitting double damage before, yeah, we're about to kind of like break that kind of threshold. So the main thing we want to do is complete this attribute section right here. Essentially, every single one of these nodules is going to be to do with an element that you can shoot out. Obviously, you've got electric, toxic, chill, and fire. Fire in this case is going to be the best one to go for. Essentially, once you hit an enemy 5 times, you then get fire attack added to your, well, obviously to your stack, equal to 24% of your firearm attack for 30 seconds. On top of that, if you then hit enemies after you've managed to get your 5 stacks, you then start applying enhanced focus rounds, which then reduces all attribute resistance by up to 20% at max stacks. So essentially this then starts combining with that to do even more damage. I'm essentially going to start showing you as to why this is kind of like crazy. So for example, if we sit at base, we are currently at 29.2k. 15.2k when it comes to our fire attack. If I then shoot this leg a couple of times, unfortunately I have just triggered the heat, but we'll wait for that to disappear. But you can see here that we do have 5 stacks. Just at 5 stacks as standard, we are now sitting at 25.8k, so not quite 100%. But if we then apply the burn on the floor, and we'll wait for that to come back. So there we go. And then pop into here, you can see we're now at 41.2k. This is just kind of nutty. This is just the base. We don't have any firearm attack increases from sharp precision shot going into that. That is just a base. That means we're doing more damage with our fire attack than we are doing with our base attack when it comes to the actual gun. So yeah, you can start seeing how these numbers just kind of like come to be. But yeah, it is kind of crazy as to how this all works, but yeah, the fire attack is going to start doing more damage than your actual base damage, and that is essentially how I've been able to absolutely melt things like Dead Brides, being able to go into Gluttony and not have to worry about it, being able to use the Descendants like Blair. Blair is fantastic because he's able to control when the fire goes down, so you don't have to rely on your gun applying it, you've just got things like that. But yeah, you can kind of tell. I mean, I'm seeing ticks for over 200k. This is a level 100 enemy as well, by the way. But yeah, once it all starts ramping up, 230k, yeah, it's just kind of up there. So you've got damage numbers like that. So that's essentially how you can get the most out of your Enduring Legacy. But yeah, if you want this kind of setup, Inversion Reinforcement, Fire Focus Rounds is absolutely fantastic, and you do want to complete the category as much as possible, so you can then start reducing their Retribute resistance. And with all that out of the way, that wraps it up on the video for my recommended Enduring Legacy build. Overall, the new mods in Season 2 have been fantastic for opening up new power levels for gun builds. Beam rifles like the Voltier feel fantastic for damage and support, guns that benefit from status like the Enduring Legacy, and the Falling Hope to a lesser degree. We are really hoping that gets a buff sometime soon. Just got a nice boost in viability from these and the new seasonal reinforcement. It's good to see Nexon aren't picking sides with gun or skill builds having power creep, and I'm excited to see what other mods we can expect down the line to customize these even further. But this is the section I want to hear from you. How are you finding Season 2 so far? Are you excited for Reyes coming in a couple of weeks' time? And lastly, do you think the Legacy will ever be dethroned as the best Colossus go-to gun in the game? Let me know all that and more down below. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video. As I always say, keep yourselves safe, keep yourselves well. I'll see you all on the next video.